Across the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, entire chapters of human history sit exposed to wind and silence, yet refuse to explain themselves. Why are massive stone complexes hidden far from trade centres they supposedly served? How does a sacred mountain absorb thousands of years of belief without ever being rebuilt? Why do carvings appear in places no permanent population could survive, and cities vanish while their monuments remain standing? If these sites were so important, why do their purposes still feel unresolved? And what do they collectively reveal about ancient movement, belief, and power that archaeology has yet to fully reconcile? Tash Rabat Stone Caravan Sarai. High in the remote folds of the central Tian Shan Mountains, where narrow valleys funnel cold winds, and the horizon is broken only by ridgelines and pasture land, the stone mass of Tash Rabat Stone Caravan Sarai emerges with little warning, its heavy walls rising directly from the alpine grass, as though the structure had grown from the ground rather than been assembled by human hands. And for centuries, its isolation has been part of its character, standing far from modern settlements at an elevation of over 3,000 metres. Where winters are long, travel is difficult, and silence dominates the landscape for much of the year. At first glance, Tash Rabat appears simple in purpose and form. A caravanserai built to shelter traders and animals along the long arteries of the Silk Road. Yet its construction immediately complicates that assumption, for unlike most roadside inns of the medieval world, which were built from brick or timber and clustered near towns, this structure is entirely stone, carefully cut and tightly fitted without mortar, its low profile and thick walls designed less for comfort than for endurance. The main entrance opens into a central hall, from which a labyrinth of over 30 small chambers radiates, many roofed with corbelled stone domes that distribute weight with striking precision, suggesting builders who understood load, pressure, and permanence in a way that exceeds what is normally expected from a transient trade outpost. The absence of decoration reinforces a sense of restraint, as if function was paramount. Yet even this functional explanation begins to fray when examined more closely, because Tash Rabat's plan lacks the large open courtyard typical of caravanserais elsewhere in Central Asia, replacing it instead with enclosed interior spaces that feel more defensive than hospitable. Archaeological estimates usually place the structure between the 10th and 15th centuries, though the range itself reflects uncertainty, and some researchers have argued that the visible building may sit atop earlier foundations, possibly extending its story further back in time, an idea supported by local oral traditions that describe Tash Rabat not as an inn but as a fortress, a monastery, or even a place of refuge predating Islam's arrival in the region. Its location adds weight to these questions, for while it lies near historical trade routes, it is not positioned at an obvious crossroads, nor near major river valleys, making it a curious choice for sustained commercial traffic, especially during harsh winters when snow would have sealed the passes and rendered long-distance travel nearly impossible. Inside, the chambers are small and austere, some no more than narrow cells, leading scholars to debate whether they housed merchants, guards, monks, or something else entirely. And while soot marks on ceilings suggest fire use, there is little evidence of prolonged habitation, storage infrastructure, or animal enclosures sufficient for large caravans, all of which complicates the conventional explanation without fully overturning it. The engineering itself raises further questions, as the precision of the stonework and the structural stability of the domed ceilings indicates skilled labour and significant planning, implying patronage from a powerful authority. Yet no inscriptions, dedications, or written records survive to identify who commissioned the building or for what exact purpose, leaving historians to rely on architectural comparison and regional context. Some have noted similarities between Tash Rabat and certain underground religious structures, particularly Nestorian Christian sites known to have existed across Central Asia before the spread of Islam. And while direct evidence remains elusive, the idea persists in academic margins, fueled by the building's inward-facing design and the sense of enclosure that feels more contemplative than commercial. At the same time, the political landscape of medieval Kyrgyzstan was far from static, shaped by shifting khanates, migrating tribes, and fluctuating control of trade corridors, making it possible that Tash Rabat served multiple roles across centuries, adapting to the needs of different occupants while retaining its essential form. Geological analysis of the surrounding stone suggests that much of the material was quarried locally, reducing transport demands but increasing the labour required at such altitude, a fact that again hints at organisation and intent beyond ad hoc construction. Restoration efforts in the 20th century stabilised the structure but also obscured some original features, further complicating interpretation, as modern intervention inevitably blurs the line between preservation and alteration, leaving unanswered questions about how the yard building once interacted with its environment. Today, as clouds move quickly over the mountain basin and shadows sweep across the stone facade, Tash Rabat resists simple classification, standing neither fully explained nor entirely enigmatic, its silence shaped by centuries of weather and passing footsteps. It remains a fixed point in a landscape defined by movement, migration, and impermanence, and while its stones offer clues through their form and placement, they ultimately withhold certainty, suggesting that whatever its original function, Tash Rabat was built to last, not to explain itself. And in that restraint lies its enduring mystery, a structure that continues to invite careful observation rather than definitive conclusions, as if its builders understood that time itself would be the final keeper of its purpose. Birana Tower and ruins. Rising from the wide, wind-swept expanse of the Chui Valley, where the Tian Shan foothills soften into open grassland and cultivated fields, the slender brick silhouette of Birana Tower stands as a solitary marker of a landscape that once carried the weight of a thriving medieval city. Its presence understated, yet persistent, visible from afar not because of height alone, but because of its isolation amid ruins that have long since merged back into the soil. Today, the tower reaches just over 20 metres, though historical accounts and structural analysis suggest it once rose nearly twice as high, before earthquakes and centuries of neglect reduced it to its present form, leaving behind a truncated column that still commands attention through proportion and balance rather than scale. Constructed primarily of fired brick, laid in intricate geometric patterns, the tower's surface bears subtle decorative bands that emerge only on closer inspection, revealing a level of craftsmanship that implies both technical knowledge and aesthetic intent, even as the surrounding terrain offers little immediate context for why such care was invested here. Archaeologists generally identify the site as part of the ancient city of Balasagun, once a major urban centre of the Karakhanid Khanate between the 9th and 11th centuries, positioned strategically along the northern routes of the Silk Road, where merchants, diplomats and travellers moved between Central Asia and China. Yet unlike many Silk Road cities that evolved into modern settlements, Balasagun faded, leaving the Birana Tower as one of the few vertical elements to survive the long erosion of time. Its presumed function as a minaret is supported by its form and internal staircase, which spirals upward through a narrow shaft, allowing ascent to an upper platform from which the surrounding plain unfolds in every direction, though the absence of a surviving mosque foundation nearby complicates this interpretation, suggesting either that associated structures were built of less durable materials or that the tower served multiple roles over its lifespan. The ruins scattered around its base, now low mounds and partial walls, hint at residential quarters, fortifications, and public buildings, yet their fragmentary condition makes it difficult to reconstruct the full scale or organization of the city, leaving Balasagun more implied than revealed. Adding to this sense of ambiguity is the collection of stone balbals, carved anthropomorphic markers placed across the site, some dating earlier than the tower itself, which connect the area to pre-Islamic Turkic traditions of memorialization and ancestor veneration, layering cultural meanings across centuries and suggesting continuity rather than abrupt replacement. Written sources mention Balasagun as a center of learning and administration, even the birthplace of Yusuf Kas Hajib, author of the Kutadgu Bilig, a foundational work of Turkic literature. Yet these textual references offer little detail about the city's physical form, leaving archaeology to bridge the gap between words and landscape. The tower's resilience is often attributed to its tapered design and deep foundations, engineered to distribute weight and absorb seismic forces, though even this foresight proved insufficient against repeated earthquakes that struck the region, gradually breaking the structure down rather than toppling it outright, a slow failure that paradoxically ensured its survival by preventing total collapse. Excavations have revealed layers of occupation beneath the visible ruins, indicating that the site was inhabited long before the Karakhanids, possibly as early as the Sogdian period, which would place Birana within a much older continuum of settlement tied to irrigation networks and river-fed agriculture in the valley, reinforcing the idea that this location held enduring significance beyond any single empire. Yet despite its historical importance, the reasons for Balasagun's decline remain uncertain, with hypotheses ranging from seismic destruction and shifts in trade routes to political upheaval and environmental change, none of which fully account for the city's disappearance, while nearby regions continue to support habitation. The tower itself offers few answers, its interior stripped of ornament, its exterior weathered but intact, communicating endurance rather than explanation. And while restoration efforts in the 20th century stabilized the structure and reconstructed portions of its base, they also inevitably altered its original appearance, raising questions about how much of what is seen today reflects medieval intent versus modern interpretation. Standing beside the tower, the vastness of the valley becomes part of the story, emphasizing how exposed and vulnerable any settlement here would have been, dependent on trade flows, political stability, and the delicate balance between steppe and mountain. As seasons pass, light shifts across the bricks, highlighting patterns that seem almost coded, though no inscriptions survive to clarify their meaning, leaving the tower to function more as a marker of absence than presence. It is not a ruin that overwhelms with scale or ornament, but one that persists quietly, inviting contemplation through what remains unsaid. And as with many monuments of Central Asia, its mystery lies not in claims of lost civilizations or hidden knowledge, but in the accumulation of small uncertainties that resist closure. Birana Tower endures as a vertical echo of a vanished city, a structure that continues to anchor history to place without fully revealing the forces that shaped it, reminding observers that survival does not guarantee understanding, and that sometimes the most enduring monuments are those that ask questions long after their builders are gone. Simalu Tash Petroglyph Complex. Hidden high within the rugged interior of the Fergana Range, where narrow mountain valleys rise into wind-scoured plateaus and seasonal snow lingers well into summer, the Simalu Tash Petroglyph Complex lies scattered across a remote alpine basin at more than 3,000 meters above sea level, its thousands of carved stones spread unevenly across slopes and stream beds, in a landscape that feels deliberately removed from routine human passage. The approach itself sets the tone, requiring long travel on foot or horseback through terrain that offers little shelter and few signs of modern intrusion, reinforcing the sense that this was never a place of convenience, but one chosen with intention. At first, the petroglyphs appear modest, shallow incisions etched into darkened stone surfaces. Yet, as the eye adjusts, patterns begin to emerge: animals in motion, hunters with bows, wheeled carts, solar symbols, geometric forms, layered one atop another, sometimes overlapping, sometimes isolated, as if the mountainside itself had been used repeatedly as a canvas across centuries. Archaeological surveys estimate that more than 10,000 individual carvings exist here, making Simalu Tash one of the largest petroglyph concentrations in Central Asia, with dates ranging broadly from the late Bronze Age through the early medieval period, a span that alone complicates any single explanation for its purpose. The stones themselves are glacial erratics and fractured bedrock, naturally smoothed and darkened by time, their patina providing contrast that makes the carvings visible only under certain angles of light, suggesting that those who made them understood not just form, but how environment and perception interact. Many images depict wild and domesticated animals: ibex, deer, horses, camels, rendered with varying degrees of realism, while others portray ritual scenes, human figures with exaggerated limbs, or abstract symbols whose meanings are no longer recoverable, pointing to a symbolic language that shifted over generations without fully replacing what came before. Scholars generally agree that Simalu Tash was not a settlement site, as there is little evidence of permanent habitation, no structural remains, hearths or debris fields that would indicate daily life, which raises the question of why such a large body of work was created in such a difficult location. Some interpretations frame the site as a ritual or ceremonial landscape, possibly connected to seasonal migrations of pastoral groups who moved livestock through the high pastures during warmer months, using the stones as markers of cosmology, memory, or social identity. Yet even this explanation feels incomplete given the sheer density and chronological depth of the carvings. The elevation alone introduces another layer of uncertainty, as access would have been limited by weather, and repeated visits across centuries imply a persistent cultural significance that survived political shifts, climatic fluctuations, and changes in belief systems. While the site lies far from major urban centres, it is not entirely disconnected from broader networks, as the surrounding region was influenced indirectly by movements along the Silk Road, which carried ideas, symbols, and technologies across vast distances, potentially informing some of the imagery seen here without turning the site into a commercial waypoint. Certain motifs, such as wheeled vehicles and stylized suns, suggest awareness of technological and symbolic developments beyond local pastoral life, while other images appear deeply rooted in animistic or shamanic traditions tied closely to landscape and animal behavior. Complicating matters further is the fact that many stones were reused, with newer carvings cut over older ones, not erasing them entirely but partially obscuring earlier images, creating a palimpsest that resists linear interpretation and suggests continuity rather than replacement. This accumulation challenges modern assumptions about authorship and intent, as it implies that meaning may have resided not in individual images, but in the act of carving itself, repeated over generations as a form of participation rather than expression. Geological processes have also played a role in shaping what survives, as freeze-thaw cycles, erosion, and rock movement have displaced some stones from their original positions, making spatial analysis difficult and raising the possibility that the current distribution does not fully reflect the original layout. Modern documentation efforts have catalogued many of the carvings, yet the scale of the site means that much remains unrecorded, and interpretation often relies on comparison rather than direct evidence, leaving room for multiple overlapping hypotheses. Local. Folklore sometimes frames Simalu Tash as a sacred place, associated with ancestral spirits or celestial events. Narratives that cannot be verified archaeologically, but nonetheless reflect how the site continues to generate meaning long after the last carving was made. What remains consistent across academic and local perspectives is the sense that this was a place set apart, not meant for permanence or habitation, but for repeated return, observation, and engagement with forces perceived as larger than individual lives. As clouds move quickly across the high basin and light shifts over the stones, some carvings appear briefly vivid before fading back into the rock. A reminder that visibility here is conditional, dependent on time, weather, and position. Simalu Tash offers no single story, no clear beginning or conclusion, only a layered record of human presence that resists simplification, and in doing so, it quietly underscores a central challenge of archaeology itself. That some sites endure not because they reveal answers, but because they preserve questions, carved patiently into stone and left exposed to centuries of silence. Sulleman, too sacred mountain. Rising abruptly from the flat expanse of the Fergana Valley at the heart of the city of Osh, the rocky limestone mass of Sulleman II Sacred Mountain dominates its surroundings not through sheer height, but through contrast. Its 5 uneven peaks breaking the horizon in a region otherwise defined by openness and movement. And for millennia, this visual prominence has shaped how people understood the space around them, marking the mountain as something set apart from ordinary terrain. Unlike remote highland sites hidden deep in the mountains, Sulleman II stands directly adjacent to human settlement, woven into daily life even as it retains an aura of separation, its slopes visible from nearly every part of the city and its presence quietly asserting continuity across successive cultures. Archaeological evidence indicates that human interaction with the mountain stretches back thousands of years long before written history, as petroglyphs, ritual platforms, and modified caves point to repeated use across the Bronze Age and into later periods, suggesting that its significance was not accidental but gradually reinforced through sustained engagement. At first glance, the mountain appears naturally sculpted rather than deliberately shaped. Its cliffs, hollows and ledges, the product of erosion rather than construction. Yet closer inspection reveals subtle human interventions, steps worn into rock, smoothed surfaces, niches carved into stone that blur the line between natural feature and cultural monument. Scholars generally describe Sulleman II as a sacred landscape, rather than a single site, a place where meaning accumulated not through monumental architecture, but through ritual repetition, observation and belief, adapting to changing religious frameworks without losing its core identity. By the early medieval period, the mountain had become integrated into the spiritual geography of Central Asia, positioned along important corridors of movement connected to the Silk Road, where merchants, pilgrims and travellers passed through Osh and encountered a landmark already steeped in reverence. Islamic tradition later associated the mountain with the Prophet Solomon, from whom its name derives, reinforcing its sanctity while overlaying older practices rather than erasing them, a pattern visible in the coexistence of Islamic shrines with pre-Islamic symbols carved into rock faces. Caves within the mountain contain petroglyphs depicting animals, hunting scenes and abstract forms, some dating back to the first millennium BCE, while others reflect later artistic conventions, indicating that the site remained symbolically active long after its earliest use. The persistence of these markings suggests that Sulleman II functioned as a point of contact between human communities and forces perceived as larger or more enduring than political authority, a role that allowed it to survive shifts in power that erased or transformed nearby settlements. Yet despite its prominence, the exact nature of the rituals conducted here remains difficult to reconstruct, as there are no extensive written records describing practices in detail, leaving archaeology to infer behaviour from spatial arrangement, wear patterns, and comparative analysis. Some researchers interpret the mountain as a place of pilgrimage, connected to fertility, protection, or healing, interpretations supported by later ethnographic accounts and by the physical act of climbing the peaks, which requires effort but not specialized equipment, making ascent accessible yet meaningful. Others emphasize its role as a territorial marker, a natural axis around which settlement and movement organized, especially in a valley where visibility and orientation mattered for trade and agriculture. Geological features also contribute to its significance, as certain rock formations resemble animal or human forms, inviting symbolic association, while acoustics within caves amplify sound in ways that could have enhanced ritual experience. Over time, the mountain absorbed layers of narrative, becoming not just sacred but storied, its meaning reinforced through repetition rather than codification. Modern conservation efforts recognize Sulleman II as a cultural landscape rather than a conventional archaeological site, acknowledging that its value lies as much in continued use as in ancient remains. Yet this living dimension complicates preservation, as erosion, urban expansion, and tourism all place pressure on fragile surfaces that have survived largely because of their resilience rather than protection. Excavations have been deliberately limited, reflecting an understanding that excessive intervention risks disrupting the very continuity that defines the site. As a result, many questions remain unresolved, including how early communities conceptualized the mountain's power, how rituals evolved over time, and how meanings were negotiated between older belief systems and incoming religious traditions. Standing on its slopes today, one can observe the city below, the valley stretching outward, and the distant mountains framing the horizon, a vantage point that clarifies why this place drew attention long before modern borders or urban planning. Sulleman II does not present a single moment frozen in time, nor does it offer dramatic ruins or inscriptions to decode, but instead embodies a slower accumulation of significance, shaped by geography, movement, and belief. Its mystery lies not in hidden chambers or lost civilizations, but in the endurance of sacredness itself. How a natural formation became, and remained, a focal point for human meaning across millennia, quietly demonstrating that some landscapes do not need explanation to persist, only recognition, and that their power often resides in continuity rather than revelation. Akbashim, Suyab ancient city, spread quietly across the open plain of the eastern Chui Valley, where cultivated fields fade into low grassland and the Tian Shan mountains rise in the distance. The archaeological site of Akbashim, Suyab ancient city, reveals itself not through towering ruins or dramatic silhouettes, but through subtle undulations of earth, broken walls, and fragmentary foundations that hint at a city once central to the political and cultural life of early medieval Central Asia. At first encounter, the site appears understated. Its remains low to the ground and easily mistaken for natural features. Yet this very modesty underscores the passage of time that has steadily reduced an urban centre of regional importance into a landscape of traces. Archaeological consensus identifies Akbashim as the location of Suyab, a major city active from roughly the 6th to the 10th centuries, positioned along a northern branch of the Silk Road, where diplomatic missions, merchants, monks, and armies moved between China, Central Asia, and beyond. Historical sources describe Suyab as a capital of the Western Turkic Khaganate, and later a significant city under Tang Chinese influence, a crossroads where imperial ambitions intersected with local governance. Yet these texts offer limited insight into the city's physical form, leaving archaeology to reconstruct its character from what remains beneath the soil. excavations have revealed a complex layout that included fortified walls, residential quarters, administrative spaces, and religious structures, suggesting a city planned for both defence and governance. But much of this organisation is now discernible only through careful mapping and excavation rather than visual impact. One of the most striking aspects of Akbashim is the evidence of religious diversity embedded within its ruins, as archaeologists have uncovered, remains associated with Buddhism, Christianity, and later Islam, indicating that the city functioned not just as a commercial hub, but as a place of cultural exchange and coexistence. Buddhist temples and stupas identified at the site, along with fragments of wall paintings and sculpture, point to a period when Suyab was a significant centre of Buddhist activity in the region, connected to broader networks of transmission that carried religious ideas along trade routes. These remains complicate simplified narratives of Central Asian history by illustrating how belief systems overlapped rather than replaced one another, creating layers of practice that shifted gradually over time. At the same time, the city's fortifications reflect a more pragmatic reality, as thick walls and defensive planning suggest persistent concerns about security in a landscape shaped by competing powers and mobile groups. Despite this apparent strength, Suyab did not endure indefinitely, and the reasons for its decline remain debated, with theories ranging from changes in trade routes and political centres to environmental pressures and military conflict, none of which fully explain why a city of such prominence faded while nearby areas continued to be inhabited. The gradual nature of its abandonment is evident in the archaeological record, which shows phases of reuse, modification, and partial occupation rather than a single moment of destruction, reinforcing the impression of a city slowly losing relevance rather than collapsing outright. As with many ancient urban sites, later activity has both preserved and obscured the past, as agricultural use and natural erosion have altered surface features while simultaneously protecting deeper layers from complete destruction. Modern excavations, conducted intermittently over the past century, have brought fragments of Suyab's story to light, yet large portions of the site remain unexplored, their contents unknown beneath the soil, waiting for future study or remaining permanently silent. The absence of monumental architecture comparable to that of better-known Silk Road cities can give the impression that Suyab was less significant. Yet historical accounts contradict this, suggesting that importance here was expressed through function and connectivity rather than spectacle. Coins, ceramics, and everyday objects recovered from the site reveal patterns of trade and daily life that anchor the city in tangible human activity, offering glimpses of routines that once animated these now quiet spaces. Still, many questions persist, particularly regarding how Suyab negotiated its role between powerful neighbours and shifting empires, and how its inhabitants understood their place within such a fluid political landscape. Standing at Akbashim today, with the mountains framing the horizon and the wind moving across open ground, it becomes clear that the city's legacy lies less in what remains visible than in what can be inferred, reconstructed, and questioned. Its ruins do not assert a single narrative, but instead invite a measured consideration of continuity and change, of how cities rise not only through ambition and opportunity, but also fade through subtle realignments of geography, economy, and power. Akbashim does not present itself as a mystery defined by missing artifacts or dramatic loss, but rather as a reminder of how central places can become peripheral without fanfare, leaving behind a dispersed record that resists final interpretation. In this way, Suyab endures not as a monument frozen in time, but as a landscape shaped by accumulation and erasure, offering quiet testimony to the impermanence of urban life along the great corridors of movement that once bound continents together.